This is Theology U, where we talk to Christian academics and authors about their work in a way that anyone can understand. Today's guest is Dr. Andrew Rillera, who last year published a very influential book called Lamb of the Free, recovering the varied sacrificial understandings of Jesus' death. It's generated significant buzz, particularly in recent weeks after John Mark Comer posted on Instagram and called it a final biblical exegetical knockout blow to penal substitutionary atonement. Penal substitutionary atonement, or PSA, to borrow from Gavin Ortlund's definition, is the idea that Jesus bore the penalty of our sins when he died on the cross as a substitute in our place. It's a very common way to understand Jesus' death. In this new book, however, Dr. Rillera makes the bold claim that it actually misunderstands Scripture completely. According to Dr. Rillera, the way that Jesus saves us has nothing to do with substitution at all, and the idea of a substitutionary sacrifice exists nowhere in the Torah. Now, there's been plenty of pushback on this argument, so as always, it's up to listeners to take your time to understand this issue before coming to your own opinion. My goal here isn't to take a side necessarily, but to engage in a meaningful and honest conversation that tries to understand these issues before taking a side. My advice, don't rely on summaries or even this video to form an opinion. If you're interested, read the book in full and take your time to understand an issue and a topic as important as this one. A couple of definitions as we get going. Kippur is the Hebrew word for atonement, and sancta refers to holy objects or a holy place. Thanks for listening. This is Theology U, episode 32. Dr. Andrew Rillera, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Appreciate the invite.
Yeah, of course. We have a lot to talk about today, all of which I'm very excited to get to, but I don't want to waste any time. So I want to start. We'll get right into the Old Testament sacrificial system. What are the two kinds of sacrifices?
Right. So just disclaimer, these are obviously very summarized versions of things that have a lot more, detail and nuance that anyone interested can, pick up the book if you'd like Lamb of the Free, where I discuss all these. But what I discovered in researching Levitical sacrifices, so these are the sacrifices in the whole Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, but I refer to them as Levitical sacrifices just for ease. Mm-hmm. And there's several different kinds, and what they generally categorize into are the two larger types. So the first of what's called atoning function. There's atonement. Sacrifices produce atonement. So we'll get into what that is in a second. Mm-hmm. And the second we'll summarize as just non-atoning. So there's sacrifices that have an atoning function, and there's ones that do not have that function. They are basically just sacred meals, where there's a communion. So you'll get names, translations of these as fellowship offerings or communion offerings, sometimes peace offerings or well-being offerings. And there's three subcategories of those. But for the sake of just summarizing everything, so you have the atoning, you have the non-atoning ones. And do you want me? I'll explain a little bit more about the non-atoning ones.
Yeah, I have an example. Maybe this will be a helpful starting point for a non-atoning sacrifice. I'm looking at Exodus 29. For generations to come, this burnt offering is to be made regularly at the entrance of the tent of meeting before the Lord. There I will meet you and speak to you. There also I will meet with the Israelites, and the place will be consecrated by my glory. So I will consecrate the tent of meeting. It's kind of what your point. It's a meeting with God, like you talked about a sacred meal, something like that.
Yeah. So that's a good. The whole burnt offerings are essentially conceptualized as a meal that only God consumes, mm-hmm. right? And it's known, and I go into this, that they don't, in the text, they're not actually thinking God is eating this for real. So it's a metaphor, but the burnt offerings essentially are like the attraction element. So that produces a soothing aroma. And as you just read, there I will meet with you. And then what follows, ritually, you would always do the burnt offerings first, the whole burnt offerings. And then you offer the peace offering, the well-being offering. And that's something that's split three ways between the offerer, the altar, and the priest, the officiating priest. It's not something that generates well-being. It's something that is acknowledging the state of well-being, and you're celebrating and thanking God for this. And for these, there's no reference to sins. There's no reference to kippur, the Hebrew word for atonement. Their function is in the presence of God. It's communion and fellowship in the presence of God over a sacred meal. An easy way to differentiate if something has an atoning function or not is if the offerer is able to eat it, outside of the burnt offerings, which there's some nuance there too. We have to look at the footnotes and stuff, but for ease of conversation. But when you're offering a sacrifice that has an atoning function, either for something sinful that needs a remedy, or for something not sinful, for instance, childbirth or major ritual impurity that requires a sacrifice, things that are generated by just being in these mortal bodies. And when you do those, though, when the offerer does them, they don't eat. You're not allowed to share and to have the meat from an offering that is purging something that you've contaminated, like you're responsible for some sort of contamination on the sacred space, and whether that could be because of your sin or because of childbirth, whatever those things. But if you're eating it, if you're eating it, then it doesn't have that function. If it has an atoning function, then the offerer cannot eat it themselves. And so that's helpful just to kind of tease going forward, like when we're analyzing the Lord's Supper, which is the only time we get Jesus associating himself with any sort of sacrifice. We get in the New Testament the other writers talking about Jesus in sacrificial terms, but I just mean like according to the written record on Jesus' lips in the New Testament, he associates himself with sacrifices in the Lord's Supper. But because they are eaten, we already know he is not associating himself with a kippur sacrifice.
Yep.
But because I've been misunderstood on this in a recent review of someone who probably didn't read even just the back cover of the book, Jesus is associated with the atoning or kippur sacrifices. I'm just saying he himself does not make that association. This happens in texts like Hebrews and 1 John. So yeah, I'm sure we'll get to that in a second. But so those two categories, atoning, you're decontaminating something on the sancta. I'm sure you'll want to dive into that a little bit more. And then the non-atoning, nothing to do with sins, nothing to do with forgiveness, no kippur, and the offerer is often sharing in this meal outside of the burnt offerings, which are the attraction. So even when the priests are offering atoning sacrifices for their own, like when a priest sins, they can't eat it either.
You're right. It burns up. It goes away.
And the day of decontamination, no one's eating those. They're getting burnt outside the camp. So atoning sacrifices, if they are atoning, kippur, decontaminating, something you're responsible for, even if you're a priest, you do not eat it. You're not allowed.
Right. Okay, great. So if we continue on, let's talk about Passover is a helpful example, at least was for me. What kind of sacrifice is going on with Passover? Because of course we have very, very clear New Testament connections to Passover with Jesus. So if we want to understand Passover correctly with the terms that you're laying out, talk about what's happening with Passover.
Yeah, so it's just observing what's not said at first. So no atoning function mentioned ever in relation to Passover. We also know it's eaten. It follows it's its own unique thing. So there's three different kinds of well-being sacrifices. There's the what's called like the free will offering. It's kind of like a just because, just want to do it. Then there's the votive offering, which is you've made some vow, to God. Like if these conditions are met, I'll throw a feast. And those conditions can be like, if I recover from this illness, if this business trip goes well, if so-and-so comes back, like whatever the if is, so you're making a vow. Once these conditions are met, then I'll throw a sacred feast. We'll have a well-being sacrifice feast. Those you have 2 days to eat the meat, the sacrificial offerings. And there's a grain offering that accompanies them and a drink offering and all this, like a full-on meal. You got your protein, carbs, and drink. But you get 2 days. You get 2 days expiration date. The Thanksgiving ones, though, so the third kind, these only have a 1 day expiration, and they require unleavened bread as part of their whole meal. And so Passover, sharing those elements, when you look at like you have to eat it within a 1 day period and then burn whatever's left over, whatever has not been consumed by the family or whatever, and the presence of an unleavened bread. That tells scholars this is like a corporate Thanksgiving offering that is commanded to do, annually. Whereas, regular Thanksgiving offerings, you could do it kind of like on a free will basis. You're just thanking God for your present, whatever, your well-being. For it's almost like a free will offering, but you're designating this as I'm specifically giving thanks to God for something. And when you designate it as a Thanksgiving offering, then the sacrificial elements only have a 1-day expiration. So Passover, it's eaten, it has unleavened bread, has a 1-day expiration date. Mm-hmm. Kippur is never mentioned in any Exodus later on, like it's never mentioned with association with Passover. And so the best way to categorize it is as a corporate, like a communal Thanksgiving well-being offering. But interestingly, the first one that you read about in Exodus, it's not a sacrifice. It's only a sacrifice when it's done on the annual basis, remembering and recalling that event. The first one isn't a sacrifice because no priests officiating, no altar, nothing's going up and burn on the altar and going up, ascending, and then they are instructed to roast it, to roast the meat, eat it roasted, which I think I've solved this long-standing, I'm kind of annoyed about it, because there was a good instance of like, well, look, Exodus says to roast it, Deuteronomy says to boil it, and then Chronicles is like, boil it in fire or something like that, when it's recalling or it's the other way around, like you roast it in water. I forget how, but it like combines the two. And people are like, look, they're trying to solve a thing. And yeah, maybe Chronicles was trying to do that. But to me, it makes perfect sense that the first one, you consume it. How do you not eat raw meat? Well, in the first one, because it's almost, to me, it's saying this is definitely not a sacrifice. This first one, because if you're Israel, you'll be like, wait, you're only supposed to be doing this at an altar. There's got to be, we're missing a lot of key ritual elements here for this to be a sacrifice. And so by roasting it in fire, which is one of the things that Eli's sons, as we go forward in history, they're boiling the meat and they're taking more than their portion that they should, and it just establishes the norm of sacrificial meat is you boil it, what the humans are consuming. Roasting it, that's only for God, directly on the fire of the altar. So in the first Passover, there's all these clues saying this isn't a sacrifice. It's the first thing that all the other Passovers are sacrifices, and they're commemorating and thanking and memorializing this time. So there's that like remembrance function of the Thanksgiving sacrifices, because you're choosing to memorialize.
Yeah,
it's a ceremony of remembrance of these things.
I can put it on the screen. Yeah. Exodus 12:14. This is a day you are to commemorate. For generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. So you see that's an
so then Exodus later starts talking about as a sacrifice. Like once it gets integrated into the calendar, then it uses the language of sacrifice. And so this like the reason it's roasted at first is another way to index this is not a sacrifice. There's no priest, no altar, and we're eating this meat roasted. All the other ones you can't roast it, because now it's a sacrifice and it's gone on the altar and officiated by priests and whatnot. So there's a lot of details like that that aren't just cool because they're details. They're instructive because of how then it helps us understand when the New Testament authors like are making use of sacrificial imagery and analogies. It helps us better discern, well, which type, which one, what's its function, instead of collapsing everything into this is all about atonement, or kippur and decontamination, and this is what forgiveness is. Because this is another bit about the atoning sacrifices that I wanted to mention, very important, and it's that it's not their be-all, end-all of forgiveness. What can be decontaminated are not all sins. The impurity generated from sins is not equal. So there's categories of sins in Leviticus and the prophets, but of idolatry, sexual immorality, and murder. These pollute beyond the capacity of the atoning sacrifices to decontaminate. So atoning sacrifices can only decontaminate the sancta. Those three sins in those three categories, murder, sexual immorality, idolatry, they contaminate the land and the person. And there's no ritual remedy. There's no sacrificial. There's no kippur remedy to decontaminate that kind of impurity generated by those sins. So the Day of Atonement, or the Day of Decontamination, as I call it, is not this like fix everything mechanism. It has ordained limits in the Torah that then produces Leviticus's moral theology in what's called the Holiness Code in Leviticus 18 and following. And it's because there's a bunch of sins that the sacrificial system is by design restricted from addressing. Therefore, be all the more careful to not do these sorts of sins, because it's generating a pollution that the sacrificial system, even in its atoning functions, is impotent to address. Yeah. It is not meant to substitute for and replace the covenantal corrective discipline, the covenant curses that come upon the people in the land because of the sins and the moral impurity categories. Yeah. And these are the sins that the prophets then later use, right? To say, like, this is why y'all are thinking the sacrificial system or being on the temple of the Lord. You think it can handle what it in fact cannot. They both agree that the decontaminating capacity of the atoning sacrifices are very limited in what it's addressing. And that's very important for understanding then why is Jesus, like, why doesn't he associate himself with the Day of Atonement? Why does it come only later in Hebrews and 1 John? Well, because it has a different, and it's even used by them in a different sort of way. It's not this like catch-all of forgiving everything.
Right. This is a critical point. Basically, to sum it up, and correct me if I'm wrong, no matter what kind of sacrifice we're doing, they are not enough to forgive all kinds of sins. There are some sins that the sacrifices are unable to absolve people of, correct?
Correct. And one of those, for the points of, like, a lot of people now coming to my book because what I'm laying out and arguing for rules out. It's not just different. It's diametrically opposed to notions of what sacrifice is doing, but they get labeled penal substitutionary atonement. But one of those ways of misunderstanding sacrifice is that what you're offering, the death of the animal, is substituting for the forfeit life of the offerer. So these simplistic notions, well, sin leads to death, that's the punishment, kill this thing instead. And then that establishes, this pattern and paradigm for justice of, like, addressing sin requires a death. And so you do this for an animal that foreshadows it's eventually going to be Jesus. Well, that just cannot be validated by the text, because it's precisely when the offerer's life is forfeit that there's no atoning sacrificial remedy at all. There's other instances, but and there's other reasons I go to it to support this in the book, such as that, like, Leviticus 17 doesn't even conceptualize the sacrifice of an animal as a death. It's only a death and counts as blood guilt when it's not a sacrifice. When it is a sacrifice, then it's a presentation of life. And there's other things I'm just flagging besides what I'm saying here. But I do think this is a very important, just basic observation, that whatever the sacrifices are doing, whatever the decontaminating sacrifices these atoning ones are doing, what they cannot be doing, we can rule out with 100% certainty, is that these sacrifices are substituting the forfeit life of the offerer. You're you did a sin, you need to either be cut off or have the death penalty. But instead, we're exchanging that necessary death that must happen, this forfeit life, and we're going to forfeit the life of this animal instead. That is 100% cannot be what's going on in the sacrificial system, precisely because that is the exact situation in which they are left without a kippur, atoning, sacrificial remedy.
Yeah. So this also central point, like you said, you already laid it out. The simplistic notion that I committed a sin, so I deserve to die, so the animal dies instead. You are saying absolutely not, cannot be, not justified by the text, not there, not true. Correct?
Correct.
Because I mean, that is such a common reading of the Old Testament sacrifices. It is so common. That's what I was taught growing up, is that, hey, something's wrong, something needs to die. So instead of you, it'll be the animal. So if that's not so, that's not
yeah,
that is not what's
classic. It's a classic case
no.
of like on a societal level, just kind of the snowball effect of knowing just
Right.
enough to be confused. What we're in this mess because a bunch of people only took like half understood facts of a sacrificial event that could be true of any culture at any time. This animal's dying in some ritualistic way.
Yep.
And running with it.
Right.
When sacrifices are different in every culture, however much there's some overlap, that's why we got to attend to the details. And I was ironically trained initially, my undergrad, very conservative institution, and taught by folks who were graduates of the master's seminary, and several of them were. And one of the ironies is like part of their biblical hermeneutics or their method of interpretation is grammatical historical exegesis. So we got to know the historical context. We got to know the grammatical context. We got to make observations. Like that was a lot of my assignments, to just read the text and observe what's there, what's not there. And it was through that process that I discovered we've built a whole systematic theologies and frameworks that just don't hold up to basic observational scrutiny.
Yeah.
And then you get into more scholarly scrutiny, what I mean, like the higher level, like, okay, let's actually know Hebrew, for instance, let's know some of these like adjacent cultural customs and whatnot, or use of blood. Yeah. Like compare and contrast and do the heavier lifting. And it even further crumbles because it's just caricatures. Does an animal die? Yes. From an outsider's perspective, an animal dies. But great historical work knows that you can't just analyze something from an outsider's perspective. To the best of our ability, we have to try to inhabit the logic and rationality from within. From what do they think they're doing? Let them build their own lexicon, as it were, and build their own ritual understanding and interpretations. And we see that in Leviticus 17, and it's clear that what they think they are doing when they go through these rituals of a animal's death, they think they are transforming that event from being a killing. They think they're taking that event and transforming it into a presentation of life. It's not a killing. And moreover, they know that when your life is forfeit, this ritual will not, it's not, offer 1,000 bulls or whatever, or goats. No, it's not just, I'm not just observing, hey, this is absent. What I'm observing is what they're putting forth is diametrically opposed. It's just incompatible with any notion of substitutionary death or substitutionary suffering.
Okay. Yeah. So the death that we perceive of the animal in the sacrificial system is not actually conceptualized as a death.
Correct. And also, I should also flag, I'm connecting some dots, but I'm not the only one to say this, like, by any stretch.
Oh, no, absolutely.
This is kind of like basic intro to if you read anything out of so let me just name drop some people, but, David Moffat or Scott Schauf, Christian Eberhardt, Jacob Milgram, Leanne Feldman, I don't know, Baruch Levine, it's just so many, the people where this is their wheelhouse, this is their scholarly devotion. They're making these observations. So yeah, sure.
Yeah. You brought up Leviticus 17. Let's jump to that example, because I think this is a critical point to take the concept of dying or a dead animal out of the sacrificial system is incredibly crucial and important to get right before we move on. So in Leviticus 17, starting in verse 3, any Israelite who sacrifices an ox, a lamb, or a goat in the camp or outside of it, instead of bringing it to the entrance to the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord in front of the tabernacle of the Lord, that person shall be considered guilty of bloodshed. They have shed blood and must be cut off from the people. So if someone kills an animal and doesn't bring it to the temple, they're guilty of bloodshed. But if they bring it to the temple, then they're not guilty?
Yeah, so basically saying if this follows the ritual procedures of legitimate sacrifice, so offered at the altar at the same point, like all these elements make the event what it is. Right? Sacrifice isn't merely just killing an animal; it has to be done in the right place at the right time. It's blood disposed in a certain fashion, and then later on in Leviticus, it'll make a similar ritual requirement for eating clean game. But the claim is any killing of an animal, and these are specifically actually the ones that you're eating. You're talking about the well-being sacrifices. Well, also the burnt offerings as well. But like any killing of an animal, even game, that does not follow these proper ritual protocols counts as blood guilt, which is shedding blood. So it kind of raises the stakes before it undoes. It shows how this is undoing.
Yeah.
That the sacrificial process is going through the steps such that now this death of the animal is no longer blood guilt. It's no longer shedding blood. It's not considered shedding blood because you've gone through the proper ritual protocols, which basically is you've taken the life and you've given it back to the creator by putting it on the altar. And so it's a weird kind of no harm ritual, no harm, no foul. It's like once all these ritual protocols like replace by putting it in the right place, they replace the life, the blood, where it belongs, and therefore everything's washed out. It's not shedding blood. But if you do this outside of that scenario, then it counts as shedding blood. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If you kill it, yeah. And so with game, instead of it being an altar though, because you can't sacrifice it, it goes into the ground. It's going to be covered.
Great.
That's later down in Leviticus 17.
Great. Yeah. So that's helpful. Now we've talked about a lot of what the atoning sacrifices are not doing, which is helpful. But I want to talk about what they are doing, because that'll segue us into the rest of this conversation. There's a good example is maybe Leviticus 8, verse 15, where Moses takes the blood and puts some on each of the horns of the altar with his finger and purges the altar. Then he poured out the blood at the base of the altar, consecrating it and making atonement for it. What is going on there? If we've talked about, again, what it doesn't mean, what do you think that means? What is this atonement sacrifice accomplishing? If it's not substituting, if it's not Moses saying, hey, I'm guilty of something, so I'm going to kill an animal in my place. That's not what's happening. What is happening?
So the basic function, depending on the status of the object upon which the blood is applied, the basic function is consecration, is sanctifying. It's taking something from the common realm, just normal. Some translations say profane, that has a negative connotation. It just like neutral, just means common for normal use. Something that's holy or consecrated means closer to the divine presence, and divine use has a designated purpose or function and therefore sanctity, set apart for a specific role. What the kippur function does is, kippur is the result of what the purging, the hatat function, which can mean, it's kind of confusing. I don't want to get into too many details, but basically the verb there is purge, is to purify. In Leviticus 8:15, that he purged the altar. That can result in kippur, decontamination, if the thing has contaminations that need to be wiped away. But it's fundamentally purifying, purging, and that's taking it from the common realm into the holy. So sanctification, consecration. Yeah. And this is applied to objects. When people, so the priests, are consecrated, they do not have hatat blood on them. In fact, when it does get on them, it's a problem. They need to wash, take off their clothes, and this whole thing, if it gets on a vessel. So the ritual power of purgation. If it's proper, if it's done on the altar, well, then that's good. If it's on a person, that's a ritual faux pas. Then it's something still happening, but it's undesirable. Nope, we gotta mitigate that in some other way. So why this is important is because we're going toward the point that the function of these sacrifices, before we can even get to what they're doing, it's upon what are they doing these things? What their power only applies to inanimate objects. Bodies are consecrated by a completely different set of ritual means. And it's never from blood from a purgation sacrifice, from this consecration sacrifice. So what Moses is doing here is taking just a random assemblance of stones, uncut stones, and consecrating it by means of this sacrifice. So it's an inauguration. This is when everything's being inaugurated. So let's say, okay, yeah, good job, Moses, you've done that. Well, now there's all sorts of impurities that are going to collect on it, almost like a magnet generated by humans, either from just their sheer mortality, like we said, things that aren't sinful, or things that are sinful, excluding sins in that moral impurity category that murder, sexual immorality, idolatry. Yeah. So by excluding, I just mean the consecrating power of the purgation offering can't handle the amount or the kind of the quality of sins in those moral impurity categories. But I don't think that like the altar is safe from those impurities just because it pollutes the land and the person as well. Okay, but so the sins that it can't handle, now it's like a reconsecration. And this is what we get in Leviticus 16. It's reconsecrating the altar and the holy place and the Holy of Holies, these purgation sacrifices. So it's a step-by-step process on the day of decontamination to basically bring it back to the Leviticus 8 moment of initial consecration. So because these sacrifices have the power to consecrate, they also have the power to decontaminate, to atone. So does that make sense? So it's taking something that's nothing and making it holy, or it's taking something that was holy but is now being contaminated and resetting it and purging it and resetting it up so that it's now the holy altar.
And you've mentioned the sins that are also that no sacrifice can atone for. How do those get sorted out? Say you murder somebody. I think this is an important point too, because say you do one of those sins that a sacrifice has no bearing over. Yeah. Are you stuck with that guilt forever?
You're at the mercy of God.
Right. Well, but that's important. So talk about that, because I think that's an important nuance that exists in Old Testament, right?
So God, which way do we want to start? Start anywhere. I'll just start with Psalm 51. We know famous murderer and rapist. So double whammy over here for David. He's doing two things that make his life forfeit. And Psalm 51 is just like, well, of course, sacrifices can't handle this. Like, duh. So what do I need? I need you, God, to purge and cleanse. It's got to come from God somehow, because it is outside of the capacity of these the normal temple sacrifices to deal with. It's only once he can be restored by being cleansed by God, this divine cleansing, that then sacrifice can resume at the end of Psalm 51. Verse 19, then you will delight in righteous sacrifices, and whole burnt offering. And because it's once that restoration happens, well, then you can be in the regular kind of communion setting. But that's not going to get you there. You can't, these sins are a problem. They bar communion precisely because they can't handle, you've breached. You've gone beyond their capacities, and therefore you're only at the mercy of God to purge and cleanse from the divine side, which will then restore you to the right normal kind of relationship with the temple and all that. Right. So how does that happen though? How does that purging happen? So it's outside the sacrificial system. It happens either through, if it's murder, it's that the person's forfeit life. If they're guilty, it's their life outside of the temple solution. It's their own death that is going to cleanse the land. This is the language in Numbers. That's what's going to purge the land. And Numbers, was it 33 or 35? Oh shoot, I'm forgetting my Bible. It's Numbers 35 verse 33.
Yeah, perfect.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So it's Numbers 35:33. You shall not pollute the land in which you are, for blood, pollute. And this is also going back then to the sacrifice. So if you do those, and even if you do kill animals, and it's not in this way, polluting the land with blood, hence do it this way. Yeah. But there is no expiation or atonement that can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of the one who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell. For I, the Lord, am dwelling in the midst of the sons of Israel. So right there, saying there is no sacrificial decontamination possible, but the land is polluted. The only way in this verse is except by the blood of him who shed it. Now, again, Psalm 51 is like, well, there is another way, and namely God's divine cleansing. And so what we find in the prophets, especially, is an analogy to bodily ritual purification. So in order to be at the temple, the tabernacle, whatever we're talking, like, doesn't matter, the sanctuary, whatever, in order to be there and offer a sacrifice of any kind, the person themselves, because they're going to be in contact with something that's now holy and consecrated, you have to be ritually pure. And this has nothing to do with sins either. It is, following Jonathan Clawins and others, this has to do with aligning ourselves, like ritually speaking, shedding things that mark our finitude and mortality, our beginnings and endings. That's why childbirth generates impurity, and so does death, being in the presence of a corpse, which is a good thing to bury. You should, there's mourning periods, but it just means you're not eligible. What ritual impurity, let's say it this way, what ritual impurity is indexing is access to the sanctuary, to sacred space. Do you have access or not? Can you access the space or not? Weirdly, a murderer can be ritually pure and access the sanctuary and take hold of the horns of the altar, because ritual impurity isn't about moral purity. It's about presenting your body in such a way that it is ritually freed from human finitude and death. It's a way of, I think, announcing, for a little theological tidbit here, of resurrection life, of exalted life away from death and into the presence of God. So that's the state you have to be in to access the sanctuary, eat, say, the Passover or some other well-being offering, because it's holy. So you have to be clean, ritually clean, in order to touch it. All right. How do you get ritually pure? When you contract some sort of ritual impurity, which is probably a near daily occurrence. Most ritual impurities resolve within the evening. It's like, just wait till the next day. The passing of time is enough. Usually, though, accompanied by some sort of by a ritual immersion. So a baptism of sorts. You cleanse the body, wait till sunset, and then bam, now you're ritually reset. Some impurities are so severe that they require that purgation sacrifice, to cleanse, because the impurity is no longer just on the person, but it's clung to the sanctuary in some way. Yep. Don't need to get into the details of that. It's just that how bodies are cleansed, ritually speaking, is through passing of time and water. And that's exactly how then the prophets speak about, okay, here's how God is going to cleanse the people who are just saturated within either themselves or in the community with murder, idolatry, sexual immorality, and the way the prophets kind of expand those. Like what is murder? It's very similar to Jesus. It's not just actually like killing someone yourself. It could be economic exploitation, is like a slow bloodshed. Several of the prophets, and I detail all this in the book. But therefore, what they're waiting for, what the hope of this moral purification that the community needs, because now they end up, in exile. The land so polluted, as Leviticus says, it vomited them out. So they're not imagining, well, what we need is we need a big day of atonement. Like, no, the Day of Atonement only works in a functioning temple. The problem with these other sins is that they collapse the very ground the temple's in. So the whole thing is gone. So they're not waiting for, a giant cosmic day of decontamination or whatever. What they're awaiting for is a divine water washing. So just like bodies are cleansed with water, so then the spirit gets analogized to being washed. This is Ezekiel 36, and various other places throughout, and it's also in Psalm 51. And that's then why John, the immerser, for instance, is like, hey, it is time. The time is here. It's complete, and come wash as a symbol for what's about to be enacted. And he says, right, the one coming after me is going to baptize or immerse, purge in more potent forms than just living water. Right? It's going to be fire and the divine spirit. And fire is one of the most purgative, purifying elements, aside from living water. Running water, overcome the forces of death. So those moral impurity sins are not dealt with in a sacrificial way in the prophets. They are dealt with on analogy to ritual purification, and putting that as a divine water washing and the sufficient time elapsing.
Right.
So it's kind of like the humans are like the scale disease on the skin of the land, as it were. It gets washed away and then to be restored.
I think Psalm 51 is a great example, particularly because it's familiar, and you have David who's, like you said, committed sexual immorality and killed somebody, and he doesn't go and immediately start offering sacrifices to make up for it. His immediate reaction, because if it was that simple, and if it was a substitutionary thing and such a simple process, David would have, presumably said sorry and gone and killed a bunch of animals and made up for his sin. But instead he doesn't do that. He calls out to God and he says, forgive me. Which to me is very explicitly acknowledging, I know a sacrifice isn't gonna accomplish this. It's not gonna make me right before you. I need something else. I need you to show me mercy. I need you to forgive me, like you said, in your divine, decision
wash
to forgive.
Me, he says, right?
Right,
wash.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then it's a great, at the end, like you already read it, the last verse, then he says, so then I can go back and, cleanse me so that I can go back to offering sacrifices, which again shows that the point of the sacrifices is not just a substitutionary, making things right, that it's what David asks to be made right so that he can then go offer some more sacrifices. So it's a totally, it's so much more than that.
And it like, it's just, it's simple in the sense that like, well, it's just there in the text, but it often is hard for many people growing up and hearing, these kind of very simplistic notions of sacrifice. But like the sacrifices do not replace the covenant discipline, the curses, which Moses calls death. Held before you life and death, and they're in Leviticus. They're not taking the place of those. And Lamb of the Free, I talk about like some of my problems with penal substitutionary atonement. There's issues with substitution, but the penal side, this is where it's a little bit more complicated. Like there is a covenantal penalty, covenant discipline. Like I prefer to stick with the curse language, covenant curse. But this is why I use the phrase covenantal curse solidarity a few times. I'm not. You can't read the Bible and try to have something that's like no God's wrath or something like that. That God's doesn't have accountability for sin and injustice. What penal substitutionary atonement gets wrong though is how it frames all that and how it links it into the sacrificial system, thinking that the animal's death is somehow the penalty. It's like, no, actually the sacrificial system explicitly says this is not the covenant death and those curses, which are the result of the sins that are more severe, and therefore their polluting power is more severe, and there's no sacrificial remedy for that. So where there is divine correction and punishment and curse and this death, and the punitive discipline there outlined is exactly what the sacrifices cannot handle, if that makes aren't addressing. Like the penalty aspect in penal substitutionary atonement isn't wrong because of they're saying, hey, there's consequences for sin. It's that they're framing that with relation to the very things that cannot address God's covenantal discipline and the curses that Moses calls death. So when Christ, what his salvation that he's bringing is what I said is double participation. He first participates to the fullest extent of sin's grip and death on us. He touches it. So just like he touches someone and purifies them or cleanses them or heals them with his just indestructible life, his pure just life itself. That's his contact with death and death as framed as covenant death, the way the crucifixion is, as the destruction of the temple in a nutshell. He's experiencing the weight of these moral impurity sins. He's right there in it, but not as a substitution. The temple still destroyed. He tells people, you'll be baptized in my baptism, take up the cross, and no one's escaping these things. It's a way through. He comes and contacts us so that now it's first participation. The double is then we participate with Christ in his life, and by participating, being co-crucified, his death, co-buried, and exalted. But that salvation is not a sacrifice. That salvation is Jesus coming in and touching death qua covenant death, these curses. It's celebrated. We memorialize that event. We celebrate that, Jesus says, through this non-atoning Thanksgiving sacrifice of Passover, and actually another one, covenant inaugurations. We're eating the sacred meal, praising God that he has delivered us in this cosmic exodus and defeated the pharaohs of sin and death. But that, like, Jesus' death has multifaceted meanings in the New Testament. We got to attend carefully to when is it talking about Jesus' death as death, qua death, and when is it talking about Jesus as a sacrifice? Because we notice, as I think I outlined, and again, a lot of these aren't just me. A lot of these are just me connecting dots with other people have seen. When Jesus is talked about in terms of sacrifice, the suffering, the death aspect, that's not used. This is actually from Christian Eberhard. He's the first person to was like, oh, this is a helpful thing as well. Observation. It's just interesting that when Jesus is used, when sacrificial imagery is applied to Jesus, it's not in context where it's talking about his suffering and his violent death. It's celebratory of a victory. So you're giving thanks, hence Passover connections and stuff, or the new covenant being inaugurated. Or it's talking about his consecration of the sanctuary in the heavens in Hebrews. But when it talks about his death as suffering, as coming into contact with the covenant curses, sacrificial imagery is avoided.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot there, and I'm happy to now transition into obviously what I'm probably most interested. I know you're interested in how Jesus connects with him. Obviously.
So I said, I got ahead of myself a little bit there.
Yeah. But it's good. Now you laid it out, and now I want to kind of pick through the things you said and clarify some points just for the sake of my full understanding. I think for me, I come back again to Psalm 51, where you have David asking for forgiveness from God. And he says, God, you are the one with the power to forgive me, apart from the sacrificial system. And that and
it's not just that. This is like, let's get a little bit more. It's the wash, right? Yeah. He's the language even there about the ultimate goal of like release or forgiveness. It comes by means of a divine washing, which means it's being yet again, just reinforcing that point. How are people cleansed? Not through atoning sacrifices. That cleans sancta. What cleanses and purifies bodies is a washing in time.
Yeah.
Now, when you're talking about something like you really need well, that's God's washing, by the Spirit and all that. So I just think that language, that it's not just about forgiveness, like as an abstract concept happening outside. It's specifically analogizing to the ritual impurity protocols, which help us maintain this distinction between the function of an atoning sacrifice and what it's purging versus the types of things that purge human beings.
Okay. That's helpful. So then if I posed you started touching on this already, but if I posed you a simple question like, how does Jesus save us from our sins? That's the common use in the New Testament. How does he do it? What does that mean to be saved from our sins in, kind of building off of what we already talked about with the sacrifices? How does Jesus save us?
Well, the annoying answer is, well, it depends which passage we're talking about, right? So,
Sure.
like, because it's going to be different. There's going to be some overlap. So it's going to be different when Paul's talking about become a curse versus when Peter's talking about delivered us from the feudal ways of life that we've inherited from our ancestors or whatever. So there's nuances because each passage is going to be different. So this is why, just to alert, like, I have a chapter on, here's a lot of verses that people think are either about penal substitutionary atonement or just about sacrifice, but I argued the usual suspects here. So Galatians 3 there became a curse, etc. In First Peter as well, and its use of Isaiah 53, the ransom sayings, like go through a bunch of different ones. He who knew no sin became sin, all that. So in each one of those, I make a twofold argument. One is this isn't a Levitical sacrifice it's not any of them. So let's get sacrifice out of our, and these are meant to be function as like case studies of like, okay, well, I can't talk about every single text, but apply these kind of observations and interpretive methods and everything we set up in the Old Testament section, and you'll be able to sort out any other text that you possibly want. I mean, I've done all this. I just didn't put it all in the book because it's way too long anyways. Like there's a lot more where that came from, as it were. But what I've noticed in there is then the second part of the argument. So the negative part is this isn't Levitical sacrifice. The other part is, well, what is going on then? And that's where then we get to the diversity of like, well, how is Jesus saving us? Well, it depends, like, which text are we talking about here? My answer to that would depend on if we're talking about Mark 10 or if we're talking about 2 Corinthians 5 or whatever. But I think broadly speaking is kind of what I already just said earlier about this double participation, that I think when you step back a little bit for all the differences, I think the picture that does emerge, Jesus's participation. So it's not place taking, it's place sharing. It's place with, it's his self with us. And it has a benefit, saves us from our sins, because by joining his life, the divine life, to the depths that we've fallen, as Paul says, nothing can separate us from the love of God as shown in Christ. There's nothing. He lists a bunch of things, and I've heard someone say like, well, notice sin's not in there. Well, yeah, sin's not in that list because he's already dealt with it in Romans 5 through this, like, while we were sinners and ungodly, like Christ demonstrates God's own love for us. So especially in the context of love. So yes, sin's a part of that list. What is happening is, I think on analogy, and I spell this out also in the Lamb of the Free itself chapter, which is chapter 5. So dealing with the non-atoning sacrifices, is it's Jesus' contact, just like him touching and coming into contact, and that is the healing and the release. Well, it's Jesus's experience of death as covenant death, as covenant curse with us. And Israel is a microcosm of the whole world, already being, as Paul would say, it's just at all humanity. What Israel is experiencing is just a replication of the curses in which all the nations are already living and existing under, born into. And Christ coming into that situation and having contact with it, now he's bound the divine life to Adam, the full incarnational mission, accomplishment, the union of divine and creature. That has a saving effect. He didn't only do this, this is a little aside, he didn't only do it because it's like, oh shoot, creation went wrong. Like, what am I to do? I think God always intended to be incarnate in Christ. That is our archetype of being made in Christ's image. As Paul said, we were created in Christ Jesus instead of created in the image of God. We're created in Christ Jesus for good works. But that has saving effect now. So that union, that coming into contact, is both our creation and our salvation. And it has healing effect because God has bound himself all the way to the point of death, even death on a cross, experiencing covenant curse solidarity, sharing our place so that we can share his.
Okay, so that's helpful. Talk about communion then. And it was helpful for me in reading the book. in kind of bringing together the picture of what Jesus is doing and how Jesus is thinking about himself and what his life is doing. Communion was helpful for me. So maybe could you lay out a little bit what you see happening there? I think it will be clarifying.
Like in Lord's Supper communion, right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So the way I read is mainly from Paul's explanation of what's happening in 1 Corinthians 10 with our sharing in the Lord's Supper and in the one bread and the one cup. He says in 1 Corinthians 10:16, the bread that we break, is it not a sharing or a koinonia in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all share of the one bread. And that concept, it seems to me that Paul's taking advantage, not in a bad way, but it's taking advantage of the fact that what we have in the Passover is a celebration. It's a very like Christus Victor, right? It's a celebration of liberation from the Pharaohs, from Egypt. And now it's sin and death, the reign of sin and death and all that. And we eat it. It's a meal that you share. And then he uses that in an ethical, moral way. He turns us to an ethical, moral framework by saying, well, this is the way we remind ourselves that we're to be conformed to the shape of Christ's death for one another. So we're discerning the body of Christ as that we are members of this body that is shaped by the character of the cross, by his shed blood. And when we eat and drink, we are reminding ourselves of that co-crucifixion, of that conformity to the Christ-like pattern, enabled then to share in the life of Christ through this meal that conforms us to the mind and body and way of our blood now being able to be for the sake of the world. So Paul in 2 Corinthians, not talking specifically about the Lord's Supper, but will say like, my life is a living out of the death of Christ so that life may be made known in you. And I think it's pretty, like the participatory, like the shared nature, the fact that the communing nature of just the well-being sacrifices in general, Paul takes advantage of to say, yeah, and this is our eating of the Lord's Supper is just that, it's a participation in a greater kind of more elevated sense. It's not just for Paul a memorial. I think for him, the way he's talking about this sharing and how it brings about the very thing it's proclaiming and shapes its participants into Christ likeness. So that's more than just like imitate this example. It's a thicker claim than that. That it's the very participatory nature of the sacrifice that energizes Paul's participatory ethics. Does that make sense? Like he turns it to an ethical framework, and we lose that if we lose participation, if we lose solidarity and union, because this is what grounds a lot, and so does baptism in Romans 6 and elsewhere. But these rituals, for lack of a better term, ground Paul's pastoral ethic, his moral advice. And that moral advice is always Christ-likeness, cross-shaped living that is patterned after the death of Christ.
I think what I'm hearing you say is participation, Jesus with us, and that there's a saving function, that his willingness to, like you said, take on a curse and take on the human condition is itself a saving act.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? Is that how you would explain it?
Yeah, that's not the fullness, but it's definitely a part of.
Yeah. So keep going.
Often goes missed.
Take that. And finish
well,
it.
like I'm still trying to. I think it might just be better if I read a bit about where I talk about the Lord's Supper.
Sure.
To return back to that question, but the saving significance of what Jesus is doing, the incarnation itself but it's like it's a full life of Christ. Yeah, that whole thing is the saving event. It's the becoming sin, taking on the likeness of sinful flesh.
Yeah.
And I talk about that verse, that's Romans 8:3, the taking on the likeness of sinful flesh, becoming sins, 2 Corinthians 5:21. But these are incarnational claims. And so, yeah, I think for Paul, the event of the incarnation has it's key. You can't, mm-hmm. It's not just like, well, it's necessary so that you can have a body that dies or something. It's like, it's the fusion of the divine into the creaturely, into sin's domain, and that obedient life breaking sin's reign. At the end of chapter 5, this is on page 207, this is what the participatory nature of the well-being sacrifices make possible and intelligible. I guess I'm picking up on a point from the paragraph above about how the consistent witness throughout the New Testament is that people are purified as they contact the risen Jesus, or rather as Jesus contacts them by touching them with his Spirit. I give a bunch of verses. This union with Jesus is described as co-crucifixion. It's Romans 6, Galatians 2, or cross-bearing, Mark 8, and parallels, and co-suffering with Jesus. So this union describes co-crucifixion, co-cross-bearing, co-suffering with Jesus. Now picking up what I was saying, this is what the participatory nature of the well-being sacrifices make possible and intelligible. This is why Paul says that eating the sacrificialized Lord's Supper is a participation, or koinonia, in Jesus' shed blood and broken body. But more than this, the Lord's Supper unites all partakers to each other. Basically, to the extent to which believers are living narrations of Jesus' death, they are having koinonia with Christ crucified. A cross-shaped, cruciform pattern of life is the theological result of Paul's well-being sacrificial imagery. So it's like, what I'm trying to highlight is that he's specifically drawing our attention to things that often go unnoticed about Israel's sacrificial system, which is namely, when the offering is eaten, there is a sharing, a koinonia, a connection established there. And he's like, and this is what we're doing in the Lord's Supper. And what is that connection established in union? Cross-shaped, cruciform living for one another. We become embodied narrations, living stories of Christ crucified. And in no place in this conception of what's going on would the concept of substitution make any sense, because that is place taking, and this is all about place sharing. This is all about conformity, union, participation, solidarity, all the other things.
Yeah. We haven't talked about substitution a lot. I know we've been dancing around it in a sense. Is why do you think that the concept of substitution, or Jesus in our place instead of sharing our place, like you keep using, why is that so? Why is that such a problem in your view? Why is substitution so questionable?
Yeah, so two main reasons. One, I just don't think I don't think it's accurate. It's not accurately conceptualizing what the authors are saying. So I don't know how someone can read Jesus, for instance, the ransom saying, and they'll be like, oh, give his life as ransom for many. And it's like, oh, that means substitution. And as I say in the book, like, he just said, you will be drinking this cup. You will be baptized with my baptism. So whatever in the heck he means, he definitely is not meaning, I'm doing this in place of you. So don't use substitution. Doesn't make any sense in the context. You can't just take one gloss from a lexicon and just slam it on to every instance of where a word occurs. You have to let the context determine meaning. And it's pretty darn clear that this, for instance, in the ransom section, that whatever is being meant there is not saying this is happening to the exclusion of everyone or anything else. In fact, the exact opposite is being claimed. Whatever it is Jesus is doing, he's doing it as a pioneer and forerunner, because he's saying, this is you will do this. So whatever he's liberating us from isn't liberating us from the cross. The cross isn't conceptualized as what he's liberating us from, and I'm going to go do it instead of you. He's liberating us from something, we'll leave that blank for now, I talk about it in the book, but so that we can go to the cross. For the Gospels, what Jesus is doing is making a way for all to join with him on the cross. There's only one cross in the New Testament, and my problems with substitution is it generates two crosses, and you get people talking about there's a cross that we conform to, but then it's also God's wrath or whatever, and all this kind of stuff. And yes, as I said before, wrath is part of it, and I know like it's frustrating to like get teasers, but also I said earlier before we were recording that like I kind of don't like have a moral opposition to some of this, like doing these interviews or whatever, but I guess that's kind of a lie. Sometimes I feel guilty for participating in a like a system where probably not your viewers, like, right, we're interviewing like nerds, right? So this channel's accepted, so I said yeah, but it's like, go read a book, go read like a book or three, instead of spending all this time on YouTube and whatever and just getting poor representations. Like I myself, like that's one of the reasons I don't like doing this, because I'm like, oh, I wrote it, like I can't say it as well as I could say it, as I could defend all this. But anyway, so wrath is part of it. But like when it comes to my problems with substitution, it's just, in some parts it's exegetical, or I'm like, that's just not the word. That is not, you cannot get that concept out of this passage. In no other situation, if we are in a non-theological context, no one would ever apply the word substitution to an analogous scenario. And so I give a couple of those. My children being trapped in quicksand in a riverbank, down to their knees and stuff. You rescue them. You're doing something for them that they cannot do for themselves, but you're not substituting for them. No one would ever use the word substitution to conceptualize and narrate that event, because it's nonsense. And that's what drives me nuts, is like when or a surgeon, like Jesus healing people, he took our infirmities or whatever, and I use this with a surgeon, they're doing something unique for you that you cannot do for yourself. No one will ever use and label their surgeon as a substitute unless they're supposed to have Dr. Smith, and then it's Dr. Jones who does it instead. Like they are substituting, but the act itself is not a substitution. And when I look at the scriptures and how it's articulating what the saving benefit is of Jesus' death, substitution doesn't capture it. And it not only doesn't capture it, it actually makes it harder. If that's what you insist on seeing, it makes you harder to see what actually is going on, which is a call to the cross or Christ-likeness or whatever. And so the like, that's kind of the second part, is like, I just don't think it's conceptualizing it well. So it's not just a matter of like, well, let's nitpick and what's, like I kind of was to you earlier, apologies, about like the cleansing in Psalm 51. I think that was a little bit, like, I think for that conversation, we do need it, like, it's wash, like it's reinforcing that point, but like, it's more than that here. It's not just like, well, let's see what word is used or whatever. It's also, if we insist on this word, it will actually prevent you from accepting the positive point these texts are making, which is about joining in, place sharing. And it makes the cross something to avoid, which Mark tells us that is a satanic deception. We're not supposed to be avoiding this. Luke, this is the cost of discipleship. Thanks, Bonhoeffer. So like, we know our theology's off if we're constructing the event of the cross as the thing Jesus saves us from, rather than what he is making possible for us to join in with him on. And so that has more theological stakes, right? So they're two related points, but that's my main beef with it. But now let's say something positive a little bit. What I think substitution is trying to, at its best, keep before our eyes is the saving uniqueness of Jesus. It's like I think what it's trying to keep before us is this: there's a saving uniqueness of Jesus' death. But what the uniqueness is, though, substitution is just not the right word to capture that uniqueness accurately. There is a saving uniqueness to Jesus' death, and I spend a lot of time, I thought, preemptively making sure we make this point so that readers aren't like, well, like getting stuck on this point. It's like, well, read what I say about uniqueness and why it doesn't fit, and why in each passage, in each particular exegesis of each passage, you have to deal with my arguments. I'm not just making assertions here. I'm giving detailed reasons. And I don't think, again, I've written enough to know, like, oh yeah, I know what I would fix. I know what I would, amend or strengthen or whatever. I don't think I've said the final word on anything, or that it's all perfect or anything like that. It's just that if people want to engage this, then you have to actually engage the arguments and reasons here. You can't just reassert proof texts about substitution as if slam dunk, because I know the argument. I used to believe them. I used to inhabit them. I used to teach them. So I know the ways around this, and I've dealt with them. Little secret, I may have said this on other podcasts, but like, much of what I've written is against my past self. So like, I know, I'm aware of other texts. Like, I know how these the counter arguments run, because that was me. And I'm a scholar, and thankfully it's right now providing a living where I get to fact check myself for a living. And I find that fun. Again, it might not even be perfect, but only if people actually understand what I'm saying and observing, and then are able to speak to those specific bits of exegetical evidence or historical evidence and nuance and shape things, is anyone going to get a better understanding, myself included. Like, this is a complicated set of things. You have to allow yourself to get curious enough to actually start investigating these things. Like, this is just to hopefully get your curiosity up enough to where you go read the content. And I don't care if it's mine, go read someone else's thing, but just get into the habit of reading long form arguments, so that you can detect when people are playing fast and loose with the evidence, playing fast and loose with whatever it is they're talking about.
Great. Well, may that spur you on to read the book. Thanks for the honesty. Of course, it's complicated stuff, but it's worth taking the time to understand. At least in my opinion, I'm fairly certain. If you want to understand Jesus right, you got to understand the Old Testament right, and it's worth it. So thanks for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Will.
Of course.